of Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. I am Sumreen Mushtaq, postdoctoral fellow at the center, and I'll be moderating the session today. In our previous sessions this year, we discussed questions around translation, sexual politics, and nationalism. The question that we're posing today is, can kinship be queer? We have with us two brilliant professors to discuss this. Our first speaker, Professor Lucinda Ramberg, is an associate professor in the departments of anthropology and feminist, gender, and sexuality studies at Cornell University. Our second speaker, Professor Aniruddha Dutta, is an associate professor in the departments of gender, women's, and sexuality studies and Asian and Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Iowa. Before we begin, let me take you through the format of the session, which is something we have to repeat every single time. So we'll start with each speaker speaking for about 10 minutes. This will be followed by 10 minutes of a discussion between the two. And the next 30 minutes will be dedicated to addressing questions from the audience. Shreyashi, who's my colleague at the center, will be curating the questions. At any time during the course of this event, when you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to ask the questions to the speakers. So now I believe we're good to go and begin the session. Over to you, Professor Ramberg.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. I just want to start by expressing my gratitude to the Center for Studies in Gender Sexuality at Ashoka University, and in particular to Sumreen Mushtaq, Shreyashi Sharma, and Aniruddha Dutta, my colleague here. I'm very happy to be in conversation with. So I'll just jump right in the interest of time. As a concept, kinship might seem tired or even dead, to use David Schneider's formulation. To the contrary, I want to suggest kinship remains vital to think and think with. In my brief remarks today, I will map the liveliness of kinship across 4 areas: property and personhood, social life, social death, nature's cultures, and relatedness otherwise. First, I want to outline 3 points of departure, just general observations about the field of kinship and kin-making. And the first is that colonial discourses, including, obviously, anthropology, have long entangled sex and race in classificatory schemas of kinship, constructing non-elite others for elite audiences as sexually indiscreet and undifferentiated through figures of hermaphrodism, harlotry, polygamy, and sodomy. Unsituated, companionate, monogamous, heterosexual marriage enfolding a private domestic femininity and public masculinity as the civilized ground of social and political superiority. That is to say, kinship is always already a political and civilizational discourse. Second general observation: critical race, feminist, post-colonial, and queer interventions in the field of kinship studies have moved us away from exercises in description and classification and toward investigating relatedness as an open question. Queer questions for kinship include: what possibilities of life lie outside dominant kin-making practices? What pleasures and what costs does exile from kinship entail? Which lives, forms of desire, modes of embodiment are enabled and which are foreclosed through the grammar of kinship? This is third general observation. Kin-making is both disciplinary and creative. In other words, kinship can fuck us by generating forms of queer exile and social death. But we too can fuck kinship by subverting its normalizing functions and corrupting the grids of intelligibility it mobilizes. Okay, so to come to these 4 areas, first of all, property and personhood. Kin relations are entangled with material culture and regimes of property and value. Through the lens of anthropology, That is to say, kinship can never simply be about feelings, such as love. An exchange relationship between men, marriage vests in men rights in women that women do not have in themselves, to quote from Gail Rubin. In this structuralist formulation, one of the effects of marriage is gender as a hierarchical relation of binary complementarity. Marriage reproduces men and women as proper to each other, even as they are differentially placed as transactors in and bearers of value. Further, it situates queer folk and the unmarried in general as improper subjects of kinship, belonging to no one. How might ethnographic and historical attention to Dalit kinmaking in practice complicate our sense of caste as a history of endogamy? This is certainly how Ambedkar diagnosed it, that is caste. And endogamy, being a form of marriage, is another kind of property relation, right? As I've argued elsewhere, the practice of dedicating girls to the Devi Yelama might be understood as a strategy Dalit families deploy to situate themselves more favorably in a network of exchange relations flowing among the Devi, the women dedicated to conduct her rites, and the dominant caste devotees of the Devi. This is not to set the question of violation or exploitation aside, but to locate it within kinmaking rather than outside it. What might we see when we ask, how are Dalits making caste and kin? How are they breaking caste and kin? What kinds of rights and value are they vesting in themselves through their marriage practices and arrangements of property? One queer pathway through questions of property and personhood has been marked by scholars bringing conventional heteropatriarchal familial relationships and queer kinmaking together in a single ethnographic frame. So to offer one example, Amy Brainer tracks the way queer projects of self-making inform family of origin relations in Taiwan. After the death of his father, one man, with the knowledge and support of his male life partner, gets married to and has children with a woman in order to reproduce the vitality of his mother's position in a patrilineal society. Such scholarly work reminds us that kin work is never not interested. Queer kinmaking, like all kinmaking, is a territory for the production and distribution of value and its investment in persons and relations. 2, social life, death. As a grammar of legitimate positions, kinship generates exclusions as much as inclusions. It spells the terms of possible personhood and permissible relations. John Borneman renders marriage and death as a single term, marriage, death, thereby insisting on the inextricability of the legitimation of certain kinds of persons and relations and the social death of others made to inhabit the constitutive outside. Writing at the height of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, he notes that sex outside marriage has been placed outside the social as a matter of morality, perhaps, but not a constitutive element of human sociality in the way that sex marriage is. The insight that Borneman captured in the term marriage death has been elaborated and complicated in recent queer scholarship attending to the regulating function of marriage in relation to conceptions of romance, family, and citizenship. Ashley Tellis has contended that marriage often constitutes the imagined horizon of queer relationships, even as people enact a variety of effective and residential arrangements. Thinking alongside Tellis within an Indian archive of queer relatedness and politics, Nitin Manayat notes that the proposals for same-sex marriage equality reproduce the couple as the proper center of a normative conjugal matrix, thereby erasing centuries-old forms of hijra, desire, lineage, and housemaking. 3, nature's cultures. In Levi-Strauss's structuralist vision, the exchange of women between men constituted the threshold of civilization. As the means of crossing over from a state of nature, heteropatriarchal marriage was thus installed as the ground of culture and the boundary against humanity's natural savagery, or what constitutes nature for Levi-Strauss. This form of marriage assumed and asserted sexual dimorphism. Recent work has sought to upend such binaries by exploring reproductive technologies, transgendered embodiment, and human-animal planetary relations as territories where nature's cultures are being reconfigured through human activity. Scholars working through gendered embodiment and relatedness have explored biological flows and materials as cultural materials. Thinking with hormones in Brazil, Emilia Sanabria tracks the flows of sex hormones through the bodies of men, women, and travestis. Hormones materialize sex as a binary. There are male hormones and female hormones, even as they participate in producing gender as a malleable and unstable object of investment. Indigenous ontologies collapse settler bifurcations of nature from culture and emphasize human planetary relations as inextricably entangled. In their call for queer indigenous multi-species belonging beyond settler sex and nature, Kim Tallbear and Angela Wiley write, quote, "Our ability to imagine nature and relationality differently are deeply enmeshed, and this imaginative work is vital to the reworlding before us." Four, relatedness otherwise. Variations in socially sanctioned arrangements of gender, sexuality, reproduction, marital rights, household labor, and economy have long been elaborated by anthropologists through figures as diverse as Native North American two-spirits, African female husbands, Brazilian travestis, Indian devdasis and hijras, kotis, Taiwanese tongzi, urban US denizens of ball culture, dyke aunties, and lesbian mothers, among many others. Queer kin-making practices innovate and extend possibilities of sex and gendered personhood, drawing on kinship conventions and repurposing them towards queer and trans thriving. Such practices open up possibilities of thinking kinship beyond ties through blood or the law as the creative, practical labor of making and unmaking relations. Within conventional kinship studies, the house, home, or space of the domestic has long been understood to organize and ground possibilities of belonging under the sign of kin. Scholarship focusing on queer housework has contaminated the straight understanding of the domestic as a normalizing space. Marlon Bailey's work on the historically sedimented house culture and ballroom scene in Detroit illuminates the ways Black LGBT folks invest effective, performative, and reproductive labor in their houses, comprised of mothers, fathers, and children, making queer counterpublics, familial belonging, and intergenerational lineage. Scholars working with Hijra households in India have documented the ways these genealogical, propertied, religiously affiliated domestic units comprise queer families who can trace their ancestry into antiquity. Given the long history of and ongoingness of class supremacist, white colonial, and heteronormative logics imposed on and through kinship, it remains critical to push queer kinship studies beyond its taxonomic history. Let us embrace lively investigations of relatedness that denaturalize the family and begin to see and be kin otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those interesting insights, Professor Ramberg, on how we can think and think with kinship. We'll come back to many of these ideas in a bit. For now, over to you, Professor Datta.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, the organizers, for this opportunity, the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka, and also Simran and Shreyasi, and also my eminent colleague, Dr. Ramberg, for your extremely insightful and actually quite magisterial articulation of how feminist and queer studies have reframed kinship. So I am going to actually use a short presentation for my part of this section. So I'm just going to try to go ahead and share my screen if that's fine. Let me know if you can see the presentation. Is that visible? Okay, great. Thanks so much. So I want to just begin by a very quick outline of how kinship has been already queered in both academic and activist and community discourses. So while of course it's been associated in both mainstream and academic discourses with consanguineal and affinal bonds centered around biological, heteronormative reproduction and coupledom, it's been long troubled and queered in queer trans communities and academically in disciplines and interdisciplines such as anthropology and feminist and queer studies. For example, we can see how terms like fictive kinship have often come to be replaced by terms like nurture kinship through the work of various anthropologists over generations. And then there's, of course, by now quite a canonical legacy of feminist and queer work which studies non-heterosexual kinship in modern societies, dating back to, for example, Esther Newton's Mother Camp and Cat Weston's Families We Choose, and so on. So in the South Asian context, there's also various work across disciplines and also in activist discourse which has troubled or queered kinship. For example, of course, I have to mention here the work of Professor Ramberg, who is with us here today, who has troubled kinship in some of her previous work, and or rather has shown how Devadasis trouble gendered modes of embodiment and relatedness by exceeding the logic of the kinship diagram and the form of family underwritten by the post-colonial state. There's also, much queer writing from the subcontinent. For example, Nitin Manayat's work, who has written on Hijra kinship and versus, for example, the gay centralization of marriage in a lot of metropolitan elite queer imagination, right? And also there's work such as Rohit Dasgupta's study of queer kinship in Anglophone Indian gay literature, which provides snapshots of kinship beyond marriage and coupledom in metropolitan contexts, and also the work of Jai Prakash Mishra more recently in 2020, which studies non-normative conjugality among gay couples, often conducted parallel to heterosexual marriages in small town Odisha. So here I think it might be apt to pause a little bit and think about what we mean by queering kinship and what queering might imply. As Rahul Rao points out in his book Out of Time in 2019, queer has functioned somewhat contradictorily as both an umbrella term for a range of identity categories and as a critique of identity politics itself, unquote. So this duality yields at least two meanings of queering. One is that queering as an inclusion of queer people or people understood as queer, whether ethically or emically, into existing state-recognized kinship structures of marriage, something which has often been dubbed as homonormative in some of the academic and activist literature. And there are of course various critiques of this particular process that's been happening in various timelines and temporalities across the world. So, of course, Manat's work, which I cited previously, but also the work of activists in the US, such as Dean Spade and Craig Wilsey, who write how gay marriage will never set us free in 2013. This also leads us on to the second meaning of queering as disrupting, exceeding, though not necessarily neatly opposing the socially normative and or state recognized forms of kinship. For instance, theorists such as Jose Munoz have written about polyamory and cruising as sites which present forms of excess exceeding socially normative relationalities. And the work of Savannah Shange more recently also comes into mind, and who shows how Black queer aunties and stud femme socialities constitute forms of reproduction and futurity and nurture, which exceed sort of the biological reproductive frame as well as a final marriage bond. And in the context of South Asia, of course, there is some work on trans feminine Hijra and Koti, kinship that might emphasize non-blood-based forms of mother-daughter, guru-disciple, and sister-sister bonding, alongside or even above, in some cases, consanguineal and affinal bonds. And we see this, for example, in Reddy's by now canonical ethnographic study of hijras that came out in 2005, in some of Manat's articles, in Vaibhav Saria's recent monograph of hijras in Odisha, and also in some of my previous work, some of which has been collaboratively co-authored with activists such as Raina Roy, where we also have noted some of these kinship structures and how they trouble cis-trans binaries. So in this presentation, I want to go on to actually quickly talk about how these, especially these trans-feminine forms of kinship in these communities, because these are communities to which I partially belong and among whom I've conducted research for more than a decade now. So particularly focusing on that, ethnographic scene, I want to see how forms of relationality and kinship in these communities often trouble or undo binaries between coupledom and non-couple-centric ways of organizing kinship. And this, of course, continues a project that has been suggested in previous queer scholarship. For example, an issue on the ontology of coupledom co-edited by Brillmeyer, Trenton, and Chung that came out in GLQ in 2019. So a quick intro to these communities might be helpful in this context. And so Koti, Meti, Dhurani, Dhunuri, these are actually roughly synonymous or at least overlapping terms for what we might term in somewhat reductive Anglocentric language as a spectrum of feminine expressing persons, assigned male and less commonly intersex at birth, including feminine males, trans women, and various overlapping and fluid identities or subject positions. Among them, hijras are often or typically understood as feminine identified people, usually male or less commonly intersex at birth, who often form clans or lineages with distinct religious and cultural norms, and who, of course, may overlap with the aforementioned Koti, Meti, Dhurani spectrum. Then there are also terms like parik, which are used in a more etic fashion by people of these communities, but are not usually used as self-identities, like parik, panti, girya, etc., which connote the usually cis male, though not always cisgender, sexual partners of Kotis, Dhuranis, and hijras. And this is, as I mentioned, not usually a self-designation. So these terms are used mostly by a working class to lower middle class spectrum of people, many of whom are Dalit or Bahujan, that is belonging to various oppressed caste backgrounds and reside in small town and rural areas, although these terms may also be used and adopted by metropolitan upper middle classes and dominant castes. And increasingly, many people, including in non-metropolitan contexts, use these terms in conjunction with Anglophone terms like transgender, gay, MSM, that is males who have sex with males, and so on, right? So they are not mutually exclusive with terms like transgender and gay. And in fact, people might switch back and forth between these terms, depending on context. For example, using terms like trans in more official NGO representations or while talking to the media and so on. So my introduction to these communities and intra-community languages was actually enabled by the flexible and extensible nature of Koti and Hijra kinship, because, as someone who is non-binary and trans-feminine, very early on, even before I went on to undergo some form of sartorial and anatomical transition, I was adopted as a sister, sometimes a daughter, and more recently a mother within these community networks, and I assumed these positions even as, of course, many among these communities do recognize my relatively privileged position as someone who is from a middle class or now more upper middle class and dominant caste background, and also someone who is English speaking with access to so-called higher levels of academic and activist discourse and so on. So now I want to come to some concrete instances of how kinship is spoken of within these communities, and this is by no means intended to provide a sort of comprehensive mapping, but rather just very small vignettes which might yield some insights regarding how kinship is conceptualized both parallelly and in intersection with mainstream forms of kinship, but also sometimes in ways that trouble such forms, dominant forms of kinship. So one idea that I encountered very often upon my entry to these communities, or after my entry to these communities in the late 2000s, is the idea of Koti and also Hijra sisterhood as being in many ways more enduring than relationships, romantic and sexual relationships with quote unquote mainstream men. So one conversation that came to my mind while I was drafting this presentation is happened in a public gathering space and cruising space in Behrampur, which is a small town in the district of Murshidabad in 2012. So where basically, the scene was in the evening, and a group of Kotis had gathered after their various occupations for the day and were discussing various issues among themselves, including their recent romantic and sexual exploits. And during this whole exchange, one of the Kotis, Khushi, remarked, "Kotirai kotider apon hoy, parik konodin apon hoy na re." So that roughly translates to, only Kotis can become apon, that is own, literally, or trusted kins, that shouldn't be kind, sorry, that's kin, to each other. Pariks never become apon, basically. So they can never become really trusted kin. Binoy replied to Khushi saying, "Ha, kotirai kotider apon hoy, eta thik." So yes, Kotis only become apon to each other. This is true. So Binoy actually went on to play, this was actually very early after her or his entry to these communities. So at this point of time, Binoy was also working as a clerk in a government office and dressed and presented as a male in that context. And even in community context would be usually wearing attire that is socially designated as male. So he also, or she also is heterosexually married, I should say. So that's why I often alternate between pronouns while talking about Binoy, because to acknowledge their sort of navigation of multiple social identities. Anyway, so in about a year or a couple of years after this conversation, Binoy actually adopted a younger Koti as her or his daughter after recognizing her as at a public place through her lochok, or lachak in Hindi, lochok in Bengali, which is roughly feminine gait or mannerisms. And this is how she describes this this process. Age o khub bhoy bhoy thakto, কেউ যদি দেখে কিছু বলে, আমি ওকে আবিষ্কার করেছিলাম, ওর লচক দেখে বুঝে গেছিলাম যে ও আমাদের লাইনের. So that roughly translates as, earlier she or he was very fearful lest someone see her or him and say anything to this person. I discovered her or him. I understood from her lachak that she is one of our line. So line is a kind of old Indian English usage used in multiple contexts. It might mean profession. It might mean affinity or inclusion in a community. It might mean a particular form of sex. It has various valences, of course. So what I want to note here in my remaining time very quickly is that these forms of kinship trouble both cis-trans boundaries and binaries, and also the hierarchy and binary between coupledom and non-couple-centric forms of kinship. So in terms of cis-trans binaries, a lot of these sisterhoods and friendships cross sartorial and anatomical divides. So Binoy, for example, is sister and daughter to several other Kotis and Hijras who are consistently feminine attired. And later on, in fact, she went on to become, a sex worker and donned more, feminine attire more commonly in those contexts, even as her daughter, who is described in the quote that I just narrated, remained in male attire. So I have briefly noted that this in some of my previous work, and showing how this constitutes a form of spectrum that crosses cis-trans boundaries and suggests other forms of affinity, based on, or not directly based on, but which draws up from shared class, caste, and spatial locations and forms of marginalization. And what I want to here also briefly note is this: such forms of kinship also often trouble the binary between coupledom and non-couple-centric forms of kinship. So Binoy, as I mentioned earlier, is married to a cis woman and has fathered children, but a lot of the people that I have mentioned here, Khushi, Binoy's daughter, they often have expressed intense longing for and also sacrifice for their pariks or pantis or giryas, male partners or husbands. And in the case of Kotis like Khushi, that this has resulted, as she herself narrated to me in one extended conversation, in prolonged exploitative relationships where her husband basically used her vulnerability to extract money and favors from her for a very long period of time, over like 4 or 5 years. And such forms of sacrifice are also attested in previous literature. You see such instances in Reddy, for example, who talks about Kotis even wanting to, sell their kidneys for their lovers and so on. What is I think also important here to note is that while Kotis and Hijras don't usually see their sexual romantic bonds with their male partners or husbands in opposition to the bonds that they have with each other, as sisters or mothers, daughters, and so on, often the way in which kinship is conceptualized by the state, and as well as in state-centered approaches to liberation and equality in a lot of queer activist discourse, there is an imagination of legal recognition for only one form of kinship, which might potentially efface or override other forms of kinship. For example, Manath has talked about how the legal recognition of gay marriage or marriage between same-sex people might actually override other kinds of property relations, ways in which property is passed on from Hijra gurus to their chelas or disciples, and so on. Also, it kind of tends to efface the possibility of various complex forms of coexistence and intersection between various forms of kinship. And this is where I want to also slightly differ from some of the critiques of homonormativity, which often focus on marriage as a normative and legal bond, because I think, as Manath suggests, you also see the presence of marriage with pantis, giryas, etc., as in more non-normative, non-legal forms, in forms that might coexist with other forms of kinship, rather than existing in some sort of rigid hierarchy versus non-couple-centric forms of kinship. Right. So, of course, we need to critique the dominant caste queer movements, focus on coupledom and legal marriage, but I think we also need to be careful about not relegating marriage itself as a concept to some sort of backward or regressive past, or just to some form of social normativity. Also, given that, for example, in Hijra communities, there are forms of marriage which are not based on what we think of as marriage as a romantic sexual bond at all. Like, for example, chelas or disciples can claim to be married to their gurus and wear sindoor or vermilion in the name of their gurus. Often disciples from Muslim backgrounds will also do this, and that is a form of cementing the mother-daughter bond, but also a bond which is at the same time the bond of a husband and a wife, right? So anyway, I'll stop here in the interest of time, and I would, of course, welcome opportunities to elaborate on some of these points later, should people be interested. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Datta, for those crucial insights, especially of how kinship is organized in different communities, this extensive mapping of its flexible manifestations and the terminologies. And thank you to both of you for giving us so much to think through. I'm still trying to frame one coherent thought, but just thinking of a lot of things here. So, for example, the diverse processes and patterns of kin making that you've both touched upon, its inclusions, exclusions, its entanglements, thinking of troubled kinship, kinship without marriage, the class and caste questions that you both spoke of, also thinking of the questions of love and care, how queer and trans people seek out these relationships, and also these articulations of what a chosen family is and how kinship is framed in those terms. But I'm also thinking of how it is also, in a certain sense, that it is modeled on a concept of heteronormative family in certain cases, also amid limits set by state regulations. So especially thinking of the LGBTQ rights campaign, for example, where we do witness a certain seeking of a heteronormative assimilation, even as, they're seen antagonistic to the very ideas of kinship as we've traditionally, as it's traditionally been framed. And although you did talk about it towards the conclusion, but I think it would help to hear more on it. How beneficial do you think such a project is for the queer movement? And this is a question for both of you, and either of you could go first.
Ani, you wanna?
Well, I'm still wrapping my head around this. A complex question. Maybe I could briefly say this, that I think that and one of the Q&A questions that I also can see here on the panel also suggests this focus, that thinking about language and grammar, which also Professor Ramberg mentioned in the presentation earlier, that is a crucial part of this. And like, what are the various inclusions and exclusions affected by the grammars of kinship? And that's also not necessarily only linguistic, of course, but I think how we use language and what are some of the ambiguities there, the complexities there, how that often exceeds the frameworks of legal recognition and activist discourse. That might be one window to thinking about kinship in ways which are not necessarily dichotomous in terms of normativity, non-normativity divide, but which also don't, in the end up affirming some sort of hierarchy that reproduces that divide.
I'll just add that I think on the one hand, it is very understandable that individuals and communities who have been subjected to forms of political and social and economic exile would seek recognition and protection from the state. Obviously, that would make for a less precarious existence. Who does not want that, right? But, and this is to echo some of the points that my colleague Ani just made, and that is that kinship is a grammar of legitimate and illegitimate positions, and that there is necessarily always, because it's a grammar, there is a constitutive outside. So new forms of legitimacy create new forms of illegitimacy. And we have not been good in our political efforts to garner the protections of marriage at keeping in mind the effects of basically creating a space for some number of queer folks to gain access to greater forms of state recognition and protection. So that would be the thing I would emphasize, is not that marriage is not a good right to pursue, but that we need a more complex conversation about all the effects of marriage as a right once we take hold of it, or in the ways that we take hold of it. And I'll just, I'll reference one thing, a resource, online resource that I have found very, very helpful in this conversation. It's a manifesto called Beyond Marriage. And it's a bit US centric, but it's making some really excellent points about, for instance, why should our desire to make family with people, domestic, legally recognized domestic relationships be constrained to romantic couples? Why shouldn't we be able to do that with our parents or our nieces or our best friend? Or why shouldn't we be able to extend our health benefits to people in such positions? Why should we have to be married or have other kinds of legally sanctioned kin relationships in order to share health insurance or have health insurance? Why shouldn't everybody have access? So in other words, there's a series of questions about the ways in which there's a density of investment of rights and privileges that gets condensed within the marital form that produces a lot of objection elsewhere in the social. And so that's the thing we need to keep attention to.
As much as I'm intrigued by these ideas around legibility, legitimacy, and otherwise, and I'd love to use my position as the moderator to just continue this between us, but I think we only have a little more than 15 minutes to take audience questions, and we do have a lot of questions coming for you too. So I think now is the time to call Shreyashi in to ask the questions. Shreyashi?
Thank you so much, Samreen. Thank you, Professor Ramberg and Professor Datta. This has been wonderful and very insightful, I'm sure, from all the audience questions we can see. I just want to, I think, build up on Professor Ramberg's last remark on legitimacy and illegitimacy. And I think this is something that features in both of your works also. So, I mean, I think our one of the first questions that we have from an attendee is, does mainstream queer rights campaign for marriage make it difficult to argue in favor of the viability of alternative kinship arrangements, and that are explored in your own works as well? And I'd like to hear from both of you. So either of you can go first.
Okay, I will like, it's in brief, the answer is yes. But, I think we have to also acknowledge that this, these alternative forms of kinship include marriage itself, because marriage is not just a singular entity. So, for example, I remember having this long discussion slash argument in a Bengali gay Facebook group, maybe it was last year, with someone who was arguing that potentially abolishing marriage as a form of social legal institution would place vulnerable, structurally marginalized groups such as women in an increasingly precarious position because, of lack of recognition of, say, their rights to, spousal compensation in the case of divorce and various other forms of support from the state and also from the spouse mediated by the state. So what this, for example, to me seemed to miss is that a lot of marriages, heterosexual marriages, socially normative marriages in India are actually not registered. A lot of them happen among underage, people underage as per law. Now, especially now that the age for legal marriage for even women has been increased to 21. So, like in my extended queer and non-queer community networks and kinship networks, I know so many cases of people these are again cis men and women who've been married off at like 14 or 15 or have fallen in love and eloped and who are raising children at 17 or 18, like where the woman is say 17 or the girl maybe I should say, and the man is like barely 19 or 20 and so on, right? So in all these cases, there is no even imagination of the state as a guarantor of support. If something goes wrong and there's a case of domestic violence, the woman typically turns to extended family structures or, if available, for relief. And the state doesn't really come in at all in most cases. So there are so many forms of marriage which are extra legal or even illegal, but which are socially recognized as marriage, and the forms of support that are gained through that institution is not gained via state recognition. So I think that is an important distinction between, say, contexts like the US and South Asia, although I don't want to overstress and overgeneralize this. But, for example, in the US, a lot of the critique of gay marriage has focused on this, like what Professor Ramberg pointed out as this, this condensation of a lot of rights and privileges around the legally recognized marriage bond, ranging from like tax benefits to health insurance to immigration rights and so on. In South Asia, where marriage is extremely diversified and striated in terms of class, caste, rural, urban, location, etc., I would argue at least that you don't see such a neat constellation of rights and benefits around marriage. This is not to say that marriage does not bring legal rights and benefits, but it's just, I think, just by the very nature of the complex nature of the post-colonial Indian state and its uneven and incomplete governance you see marriage, heterosexual, normative marriage, functioning in a whole host of different ways. So yeah, I think we need to recognize how people actually live and make kinship in terms of marriage, and also outside and beyond marriage, of course. So this includes various queer forms of marriage. This includes non-legal forms of heterosexual marriage. This includes non-marital forms of bonds, non-final forms of kinship in trans feminine and other queer and trans communities, right? So I think we need to broaden the conversation and think about marriage broadly alongside non-marital forms of bonding. And when we talk about or critique the overwhelming focus on marriage in a lot of like metro dominant caste gay and queer discourse.
I'll just add that I think this is a bit to segue into one of the other questions, which is about method, I think. And that is that one queer way to investigate marriage as a form is to think about forms of plural marriage. In other words, to get beyond the couple. So the various forms of polygamy and polygyny, or the ways in which the conventional couple's marriage is often supplemented by other sexual relationships that are not legitimate or even open, right? But that ways in which the family and the marriage form is, you could say, can function as a certain parasite on society. What are the supplemental relationships, the concubine, the secretary, right? The other forms of investment that make the marriage possible work, right? That we don't bring into our analytic gaze. We're just looking at the couple, right? So there are different ways of kind of queering marriage, if you will, including what Ani is, I think, rightly bringing our attention to, which is that marriage is a form that people can take hold of and purpose in queer ways, right? So it's not always simply put a disciplinary form. So that's to make a certain point about method, right? That one of the ways of queerly investigating marriage is to think about its constitutive outside, which is mostly what we've been talking about, right? Who are the people who are excluded from marriage? How are they getting along? What is marriage doing against them, right? And another way is to think about it breaking apart the presumptions of the form itself. Actually, marriage is never just about a couple. There are all of these ways in which it is supplemented as a form by relations that we tend to make invisible. So how do we make those visible? And which then begins to denaturalize the couple as this, romantic union of male and female destined for each other and so forth. And then I'll just make one more quick point about method, which I've sort of made, but just to be explicit. And that is that one avenue for queer work in kinship that has still, I think, much to be explored is applying queer methods and analysis to simply put non-queer objects, right? So for instance, the Mormon family, multiple wives in the Mormon family, right? This is a heterosexual arrangement, right? But how do we think about that arrangement in queer ways? It's something I'm trying to do in my current work, thinking about what's happening within Ambedkarite households, where you have a religious division, a gender division of religious labor, more than one kind of observance under one roof. So how to think about that in a queer way, right? Not as a failure to properly convert, but as a way of drawing more than one possible future into a single household. So that's something I very much celebrate and encourage people to think about the possibilities in their own work, is how do we think queerly about things that objects and spaces and arrangements that are not themselves simply put queer.
Something that's connected to this, one of the questions is also asking about just the normalization of the heteropatriarchal family and how essential is that to sustain the fantasy of the state. And I think a related question that somebody else has asked is, how can queer kinship encounter such like erotic nationalism, where, you know, religious nationalism is aggressively used through metaphors such as motherland, fatherland. So, I mean, how can we move beyond that through queer kinship? And either of you can go first.
I mean, maybe I'll go ahead for a little bit. Again, this is a question of vast scope and very hard to do justice to. I mean, and it's also a very, I think, timely question in so many ways, because in terms of Hindu nationalism in India, this is a point of time where we're seeing increasing inroads of Hindutva into queer and trans communities, and not just dominant caste, class privileged communities in like metropolitan hubs. It's far beyond that. Like, for example, one very close Hijra elder sister, I have known for more than a decade now, recently joined this organization called Rashtriya Hindu Sangathan, which roughly translates to National Hindu Organization, which is some kind of affiliate of RSS, though not explicitly linked. And this is just one of the many instances in how the Hindu right-wing organizations have been trying to actively recruit, especially Hijra people, but also other sections of and also like dominant caste gay men, among other parts of the queer and trans communities. So this is very hard to answer in any sort of binary framing, because queer kinship, of course, in so many ways has not been recognized by imagining like heteropatriarchal imaginations of family and nation and motherland and so on. But at the same time, this is not any sort of static relationship, because we have activists like Lucinda Ramberg who have pledged to, for example, form Hijra battalions or armies to, protect the motherland from Pakistani aggression, So there's that as well. And so, these terms can be taken on, resignified in quite troubling and violent ways by queer and trans people themselves. This is something that we've seen alongside the whole, push for gay marriage and adoption, etc., in the South Asian context. So I hesitate to draw any sort of firm line between queer kinship and heteropatriarchy in that sense, and heteropatriarchal imaginations of nationhood. But obviously, at the same time, we have to recognize how many forms of queer kinship remain extremely difficult to reduce to the forms of normative kinship that are valorized and legitimized by the Hindu nationalist Hindu nationalist facets of the Indian state, I should say, and will always have a very precarious footing in those imaginations of the state, and also the ways in which that imagination of the heteropatriarchal nation is implemented in terms of law and policy and so on. So like, even if there's some sort of overlap and inclusion, it'll probably be for all but the most privileged elite of queer and trans people, it would be a very precarious inclusion, but on the other hand, we cannot also assume a very sort of straight cut relationship of subversion or opposition. I think that's what I'm trying to get at, but I should stop here in this interest of time, and maybe Professor Ramberg will also fill in some of the gaps here.
Well, agreed, 100%. It's an enormous question. And I guess I would say, make a fairly simple observation, which is that, it's an opportunity perhaps for us to exercise our queer imagination or our imagination queerly to think about what is the post-national state or forms of governance that we want to conjure. And how do our histories and knowledge of queer forms of affiliation and kin making help us bring to mind the possibility of forms of thick connection, right? That subvert, work around, undermine the forms of purity and xenophobia and genocide that nationalisms produce.
Yeah, that's very relevant. And I mean, we don't have much time, but I would wrap up with maybe one last question. And both of you have been answering this, I think, throughout your comments, by throwing light upon plural forms of marriages, by throwing light on other forms of kin making. But just, yeah, I think everybody always likes to think about hopes and futures, queer utopia. So I think one of the questions would be that how can we rework and revise social organization of the way we look at various organized social organizations like friendship, sexual contacts, communities, so that we can produce more non-state centered forms of solidarities and alliances. And yeah, I think I'd like to hear from both of you if you have anything more to add.
Okay, I guess I'll follow our kind of impromptu established custom of me taking these questions first, if that's fine. And again, like very briefly and tentatively note that, I mean, obviously this is a question or an issue that extends vastly beyond the realms of kinship. I mean, it's about redistribution and social justice and liberation on so many fronts. I think if we can, and it involves, like, in terms of tactics and strategies, many parallel intersecting movements. Like, so if we can think of a more just society in terms of distribution of resources, of land, of, you know, environmental justice and all of that, you know, kinship often or at least normative forms of kinship might be dislodged from their role that they often occupy currently of providing often quite precarious forms of security, you know, where, like, you know, exiting some normative form of kinship often means, you know, facing some form of precarity, right? Like, especially for, you know, people in more structurally marginalized positions. So in the case of divorce, like, often women are thrown into economic instability and precarity if they are abandoned by their husbands and so on, right? So, like, again, I think thinking about this more generally in terms of socioeconomic justice would enable us to think of situations where, you know, exiting normatively recognized kinship structures does not necessarily result in that kind of precarity, and not even necessarily always normatively recognized kinship structures. For example, I will think of one instance, like last year, or one instance occurs to me as I speak, where there was this incident of horrific violence within a Hijra Gharana or lineage in West Bengal near Kolkata, which actually reached the media. It became a public case where junior Hijra or Koti, who was not formally initiated yet into the Hijra lineage system, was tortured brutally for encroaching into the territory of a senior Hijra guru. And she was burnt with hot metal rods and beaten up. And it was really horrifying and brutal. But at the end of that whole episode, you know, basically it ended in her reconciliation with the same guru who had tortured her, because of lack of any other kind of support network, basically. And, you know, the guru kind of pledged to support her financially for the rest of her lifetime, although there are indications that she did not really follow up on this promise. And the one who had been tortured, the survivor, basically ended up calling the guru her mother, and, you know, and there was some sort of emotional reconciliation, the video of which was propagated in various community WhatsApp groups and networks and so on. So, like, it's like, you know, normative itself is very complex in this sense. You know, this is not a normative form of kinship in terms of state or legal recognition, but, you know, it has its exclusions, right? Going back to Professor Ramberg's point about kinship having a grammar, and every grammar then necessarily having some sort of constitutive outside, right? So then would we be able to imagine a future for trans queer people where exiting either the kind of heteropatriarchal family and or the, you know, the Gharana system, you know, would not result in that kind of precarity, which forces you to return to a guru who had tortured you and call her mother, you know? Not to, of course, say that people don't change or that we should stick to a binary of like, victim, perpetrator, or something like that. But, where it's not necessarily compelled by economic circumstances, at least that sort of reconciliation results spontaneously, if possible, but it's not something that is on which economic security itself is based for trans people with lack of access to other avenues of income, right? So I think broadly we have to think about socioeconomic justice in across so many registers and forms as the way forward if we are to think about not only troubling heteropatriarchal forms of kinship, but also so many other potentially normative forms of kinship, including queer and trans forms of kinship.
Well, we haven't been shut down yet, so I don't know if we're about to go blank, but I'll just say that I think some of the most inspiring work to me, recent work, is taking a kind of planetary frame and thinking about problems like pollution and climate change, and inviting us to remember that we are kin as a part of a multi-species worlds inhabiting this planet, which is in trouble. And what does it mean to think about those kinds of ties that go across nation and biological relatedness, et cetera? We all have microplastics running through our system. We're all breathing in air that is, how do we think about those kinds of kinships as contaminated, but about spelling a sort of a shared predicament that calls on us to act in different kinds of ethical and political ways towards a different kind of future.
With this, we come to the end of this session, although by no means an end to these conversations, which will definitely go on elsewhere and in our work at the center and through other events we host. I guess we're probably ending with more questions than we started with here, which actually perfectly syncs with the kind of conversations we have and the ideas that we engage with, as they defy homogeneity, as they defy hegemony of varied kinds, as they defy legibility and this dominant catalogs of meaning that we've sort of always been forced to, work around. And in some senses, definitely defying closure to. It was an absolute delight having the two of you with us today discussing queer articulations of kinship. And in fact, this is a very fitting finale to this year's Summer of ISHQ series as we think of kin-making, relations of love, ISHQ, and care, community building, solidarities. And thank you so much for this wonderful, insightful conversation. To all of you in the audience who've been a constant company through these 3 years of Summer of ISHQ, thank you so much for making these sessions so engaging. We'll see you all next year, hopefully when we witness less hatred and more ISHQ around us. Thank you, Shreyashi, for the curation. For everyone interested in our work and our upcoming events, please follow the updates on our social media handles. Thank you all. See you.